Well, joining me now to look at Parliament's first week back and the week in federal politics are three members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Mia Rabson is Parliamentary Reporter for the Canadian Press. And Alex Ballingall is a political reporter for the Toronto Star. All three of you, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Let's start with, obviously there's been so much talk, there's been a lot of concern, and there's been a ton of media coverage of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, and how it's been handled and how it's progressed and attempts to bring Canadians home. I'm going to ask in the most open form, what do you make of it? What do you make of how the government's dealing with it, and what strikes you? Start with you, Bob.
Well, I think the government has done a pretty good job of dealing with this crisis. The most important thing is keeping Canadians informed, and that's what they've been doing. They've had, the public health officer and the ministers, the Foreign Affairs Minister and the Health Minister have had almost daily briefings, which is the best thing you can possibly do, because we're trying to avoid a panic. And if people know what the government is doing and they're telling you what the situation is, people can make judgment calls on it. So from my point of view, I think they've done a pretty good job, and they've moved quickly to try to get Canadians out of China as well. And they've done it in a way to not to try to frighten people.
Okay, Mia, because I'm going to maybe do a second round on this and challenge a few things. Mia.
Well, Canada's in a unique position because it was 17 years ago, but we still learned some lessons from the SARS crisis in 2003. And you can actually see some of those lessons being applied and how the government is responding and the information that's coming out and some of the, partly even in China's response. But so Canada learned a lot 17 years ago, and we're finally actually getting a chance to see how that's actually going to play out in real time. I agree with Bob. The information seems to be coming very quickly from them anytime there's a case. And I do appreciate that every time you hear from one of the experts or the minister, they sort of start it with, let's calm down, wash your hands, you are not at risk. They sort of try to start everything with that to try and keep those fears at bay. Because people, they hear about this virus and they start to really panic without that kind of information.
Okay, Alex, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that it's been great that they've been coming out so frequently to talk about it, updates from Dr. Tam. Pretty much every day. I guess the only legitimate question about the response so far is maybe, or the only fair question I should say is maybe, what's taken them so long to get their plan together, even to disclose what they're thinking. They've been very, they've withheld sort of the information on whether they're going to quarantine Canadians coming back in the evacuation plan. I mean. So I guess just, the other countries have been apparently moving faster on that than us, and why is that?
That's exactly where I was going, in the sense that when you listen to the politicians and the people asking harder questions, the one area where there seems to be a lot of unanswered questions, and that is how are we getting, or what are the plans for getting Canadians back, and why is it taking so long? We've heard sort of snippets. I was trying with an MP from the government. We were hearing snippets about difficulties of getting across the city and having taxis to get Canadians to the airport, or locating everyone and all that. But there seems to be a bit of a problem in terms of communicating with regards to getting Canadians out of China. Anyone?
I think that there's also something to be said for Canada taking its time to do this. Some of the responses maybe coming from other countries are political in nature to try and might ramp up that kind of panic for a virus that at this point is maybe not at that level. Canada was partly waiting to see what the World Health Organization was going to say about it. It wasn't until yesterday that the WHO decided to say that this was a global emergency. So a lot of what Canada's decisions are based on is some of the science and recommendations coming from the World Health Organization, which didn't really happen until yesterday.
Yeah, and there has been no evidence to suggest that we need to quarantine people right now. And you start quarantining people, you start to frighten people. Yeah. And that's why one of the things that I think we in the media are and our role in terms of keeping Canadians informed is that we're learning a lot too.
Yeah.
Our level has gone up as they've had these briefings and we're able to understand how this virus works, how much of a threat it is, how does it incubate, all that sort of stuff.
How do you screen for it? Do you screen at the airport? Do you screen? People talk about the real level of screening is at healthcare institutions and sending people home with proper information. Yeah.
One of the other things they're dealing with now that maybe they didn't have to deal with during SARS, of course, is social media, which has been a problem. Even Twitter was trying to crack down on some of the fake information, and that was ramping up the panic. And the government maybe needs to do a little bit more to be forceful, even on social media, to try and shut down some of this false information.
And I know from doctors that I have friends with that this is a problem that's across in the hospitals because people are going to emergency wards thinking that they may have a problem because they have a cough. And it's really backlogging the system so they can actually having to deal with real cases. They've got people going in a bit of a panic. So that's an issue that I think they have to try to address. So people say, please, you don't have to go to the emergency.
Yeah, and this in the midst of flu season, the normal North American flu season. Okay, well, let's change the subject to something pure, very little medical aspect, and that is the conservative.
Well, that's actually a lot of medical.
The segue, it was a very
or
faulty.
Say mental, maybe.
It's a faulty segue, but the Conservative Party of Canada. This is week after week since Christmas. We've been watching with great interest. This week, I mean, we saw last weekend Peter MacKay jump in, but we also saw Aaron O'Toole announce his candidacy, and we saw Alberta businessman Rick Peterson announce his candidacy for a second time to run for the leadership. But we also saw people begging off this week, announcing they weren't going to be running. What do you make of it? Start with you, Bob.
Well, I'm as a journalist, I'm disappointed because I was hoping we were going to have a much more interesting leadership race, and I think it would actually be better for the Conservative Party itself. I mean, if Rona Ambrose and Pierre Poilievre had been in, and MacKay and Aaron, and perhaps somebody like Michelle Rempel or something, you would have had a really good contest, and people would have an exchange of ideas, and you'd get a better candidate, I think, at the end result. So now we're left really between Peter MacKay and Aaron O'Toole, and personally, unless Peter MacKay really stumbles badly, I can't see how he's going to lose this race. And I know there's some talk amongst more right-wing members of the Conservative Party that they have to get somebody else to run, and the best they've come up with, I think, is John Williamson. Who is a no-name MP.
New Brunswick MP was re-elected. He was defeated and then
lovely
elected
guy,
last
but
time.
he's not going to have the kind of credibility that rank and file members would expect from someone to be a leader of the party. Okay,
I know Alex follows this, so he's chomping at the bit. But Mia, we'll go to you and then to Alex. What do you make of it? What stands out to you?
What stands out to me is that in 2017, it was a race to try and get people to not run because there were so many in the race. And this time, it's like, oh, well, that person, nope. The list of who doesn't want to do it, who's thinking about it and has ruled it out, is longer than the list of people that are actually jumping in. And that says a lot maybe about where the party sits right now. I think also in 2017, there was an idea that maybe this was sort of a temporary leader. There were some who weren't like Rona Ambrose, like Peter MacKay, who were said they weren't going to get into the race because they didn't necessarily think they were going to have a chance to win the next election. So maybe there's also that. This time it's maybe more legitimate. They think the next election could be more winnable than maybe they thought 2 years ago. It's very interesting to me that more people don't want to do it than we thought might.
It begs a question, though. Alex, you follow the Conservatives, and you've been watching this from day one. It begs a question. This is not a party in the wilderness. This is a party with who actually had more voters for it than the Liberal Party in the last election. This is not a party that's, as Mia compares it to 2015, this is not a party, or 2017, this is not a party that's not within striking distance of becoming the next government. And yet we have the most notable stories, those who are not running. What do you make of it? And will we see maybe any people throw their hat in, because there's still a few names out there?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to watch as that moves forward. I guess there's another few weeks before they can get in under the deadline. Just going back to that idea of this idea that this could have been sort of a soul-searching exercise if there was more candidates. I think it's interesting. You guys have reported at the Globe that all the major candidates support, for example, a carbon tax, and we're not going to potentially have a big discussion in the leadership race about where the Conservatives should go. Yeah. If they should take a very different tack on climate. I guess there's other things they could do on climate change, aside from accept a carbon tax. But I think with fewer candidates, the diversity of the discussion is the main casualty there, and maybe that's a shame.
Any names that you hear, people who, I mean, we've been told, for example, that Michelle Rempel still hasn't decided whether or not she's going to throw her hat in and names that you've heard read about as possible candidates last minute.
I know that Michelle Rempel, I guess, was saying the other day that she hasn't closed the door, and Williamson are the only names that I've heard. But we'll have to see.
You raise the issue about the carbon tax. So one of the issues that comes up too with a Conservative leadership race is that you have people pitching to the base to get elected as leader, but part of what this leadership race is about is electability in the wider general Canadian population.
Yeah, you've nailed it. I mean, often in leadership campaigns, people who are competing are will target their message to the base, but if you want to win in a general election, the Conservative Party has to do a lot better in 905. If they don't do 905, they're not going to win. They can, somebody like McKay will obviously, I would think, help them in Atlantic Canada. He potentially could pick up seats in the 905, which they absolutely need. But again, the drawback he has is he doesn't speak French very well. And there are 75 seats in Quebec. And the Conservatives have to figure out a way. They need at least a dozen seats in Quebec and to do well in the 905 to beat the Liberals.
But is it a problem inherently that if your question is electability and you want to win the next election, and yet what you're pitching to the party faithful may not be electable issues like on carbon taxes, for example?
Technically, yes. I mean, obviously, the Conservatives have pitched to their base before, and they won government before, so it's not out of the question. I think you've seen sort of Peter MacKay trying to play both sides of that coin. His opening salvo was all about immigration, and bringing in more immigration, and then maybe a few days later he started to speak to some more things about to the base. So he's definitely sort of trying to keep his leg on both sides of that.
Okay. On that note, something tells me we will be talking about this again. We've got until late June. So thanks to all three of you for coming in.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you.